Malcolm, you can start now.
Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is a joint meeting between the Jewish Historical Society of England, Leeds branch, and Milim Leeds. I wish to formally thank Milim, and especially Alan, for looking after us just in these difficult times. Without them, we would not be still the most active branch of the Historical Society. We have twice the number of meetings of any other branch, and we have twice the people coming to our meetings. Without them, we could not exist. You will remember I'm involved in cemetery work. In regards, we have created virtual cemeteries in Leeds, Bradford, Doncaster, Sunderland, and so it's a good link with my niece Hester, who is in charge of the United Synagogues Synagogue at Willesden, London, where there are some interesting boards and graves. I'd like to hand over to Hester, who will explain the researches of Molly. Hester, it's over to you now.
It appears we have a little bit of a technical problem with Hester's communications. So here we go. I think Molly's going to take over for us.
Okay. So unless Hester comes back, I'll just say, I think she wanted to say something about the whole House of Life project. So if she comes back, she can take over. But I'll just explain a bit about my research. Hope everyone can hear me. I'm Molly. I started doing some research for Willesden last year, and I started doing this particular research in October last year. So it's strange to think that now, after all this time, that I'm doing a talk on it, and it's actually become quite a topical thing when we're talking about and thinking about how we memorialize the past, especially how we remember our war dead for campaigns like this. So the boards that are now at Willesden Jewish Cemetery have been there since the 1960s. And the men on them, they range from volunteers to regular officers, and they represent people from all across the empire, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even South Africa. So we're looking at these boards at a time when we're questioning the past in different ways, and questioning how we view the past, especially when it comes to British colonialism and the empire. So this isn't my specialist subject at all. When I started the research, I didn't know much about the South African War, or I didn't know loads about Jewish history in Britain. I should point out I'm not Jewish myself, but I've learned a lot about it all. So I'm not going to say that I'm an expert in everything, and I can't say that I'd be able to answer every single question that anyone may have, but I will give it a go. I should also say that I definitely don't know Afrikaans, so you'll have to forgive some of my pronunciations of some of the places. And I've learned a lot doing this research, and I can't wait to share it all with you all now. And just as a side note, I've not been doing any family research so I don't have any detailed information on individuals on these boards, just in case anyone was going to ask me about individuals later on. Okay. So the final years of the 19th century saw the British engaged in 2 wars in South Africa, and both were really important turning points for the British Empire. The First Boer War was fought between the 20th of December 1880 and the 23rd of March 1881, and it revolved around the British supremacy in South Africa and the Transvaal revolting against the British annexation of 1877. So after this war, the Pretoria Convention of the 3rd of August was passed, but it didn't fully reinstate any independence of the Transvaal, and it kept the state under British control. It wasn't until the London Convention of the 27th of February 1884 that full internal independence was given to the Transvaal. So the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 made this republic a very potential political threat to British supremacy in South Africa. The prospect of gold also lured large numbers of newcomers to the newly established Johannesburg, and these immigrants were given the name Uitlander, which is simply the Afrikaans for foreigner. They became a majority of citizenry and were led by an aristocracy of wealthy mine owners. This was also a time when Britain was engaged with a struggle for colonies with France and Germany. And in 1896, the so-called Jameson Raid was a scheme orchestrated by the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, Cecil Rhodes, and other Uitlanders to overthrow the Transvaal government of President Kruger. It caused Afrikaner nationalism to flare up all over South Africa, and it led to the Orange Free State striking an alliance with the Transvaal in 1897. And whilst President Kruger's main interest was in preserving the Transvaal, the British Colonial Secretary, Sir Joseph Chamberlain, and the British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Alfred Milner, believed that the Transvaal was pushing for a united South Africa under the Afrikaans. Milner was convinced that the Transvaal wouldn't reform and that the war would be the only way to eliminate the threat to British supremacy and to facilitate the development of the gold mining industry. After some diplomatic back and forths, a political deadlock was reached. The British rejected a Transvaal ultimatum that essentially demanded all British troops to leave the Republic at once. The South African War started on the 11th of October, 1899. So the loss of key places in sieges at Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith meant a bad start for the British forces in South Africa. And after a series of defeats in December 1899, which was widely known as Black Week, morale was low, and the British government put Field Marshal Lord Frederick Roberts in charge of the British troops in December 1899. Roberts arrived in Cape Town in January 1900, and Kimberley and Ladysmith were both relieved in February. In March 1900, Roberts occupied Bloemfontein, and in June 1900, he took Pretoria. With both Republican capitals in British hands, Robert annexed the Orange River colony in May 1900 and the Transvaal in September 1900. The event that caused the most joy in Britain was the relief of Mafeking in May 1900. But despite all of this, the enemy refused to surrender and they turned to guerrilla warfare. And the British Army failed to deal with this change in tactics, and the war dragged on for almost 2 years until there was a peace treaty on the 31st of May, 1902, which finally ended the war. So the result of Black Week in December 1899 was that there was an overwhelming response by the public, and with it came the enthusiasm of volunteering to fight. Unlike the First World War, where soldiers were conscripted, the volunteers became a crucial proportion of the British Army. And as historian Will Bennett also highlights, for the colonies, it was a chance to demonstrate their loyalty. So we also see countries like Canada and Australia offer up units to support Britain in their fight. But even prior to Black Week, support for the Empire could be seen from these countries. For example, the Governor of Victoria in Australia, Lord Brassey, wrote from Government House in Melbourne to Queen Victoria on the 18th of October, 1899. He writes, "Lord Brassey presents his humble duty to Her Majesty. the Queen Empress, and has great gratification in reporting that the patriotic sentiment evoked by the recent events in South Africa has been deep and almost universal. In a time of real emergency, Lord Brassey is convinced that Australia could and would give powerful aid to the mother country. The departure of our small contingent will be made the occasion for an imposing military and patriotic demonstration to loyalty for your majesty and the noble empire over which you rule. So here we see the role of empire having this overwhelming hold over these subjects in Britain, over the subjects to which Britain ruled over, and the importance that was seen by the leaders of these countries in the protection of imperial influence over part of the empire like South Africa. Nowadays, we can see why this war would be seen as controversial, and we're fully aware of the oppressive state that was colonialism. But for the leaders of these men that volunteered to fight a war like this one, they clearly felt it was a very important cause to fight for, and in many cases to die for, all in support of what was seen was meant to be loyal and patriotic to Britain. So an example of the volunteer units that could be found in Britain is the City of London Imperial Volunteers, or the CIV. It was raised in December 1899 by Sir Alfred Newton, the Lord Mayor of London, and the CIV spent the first 3 months of 1900 training and travelling to the Northern Cape and Orange River, where they took over posts from the regulars, and it saw numerous engagements throughout the war. The Imperial Yeomanry was another volunteer unit that enlisted many men in Britain. It was created by Lord Chesham and other yeomanry officers in 1899. And in December 1899, the War Office allowed a contingent to serve overseas in December. So this was no doubt caused by Black Week. All in all, there were about 3 contingents of the Imperial Yeomanry that were sent to South Africa over 1900 and 1901. There were so many more regiments that fought in this war, both in Britain and across the empire, as I've said already. And in South Africa, there were 2 prominent ones, which were the Cape Medical Staff Corps and the British South Africa Police. So in the years prior to the South African War, as well as during it, of course, the Jewish image was suffering greatly. When gold was discovered in the Witwatersrand and led to the flood of Uitlanders to Johannesburg, it was noted that many of them were Jewish. Some of these Jews became prominent landlords, and they were among the leaders of the gold mining industry and helped build up the city as South Africa's commercial, industrial, and financial centre. This, of course, became a focal point for pro-war commentators, both in the months leading up to the war and during the war itself, and would largely disadvantage the Jews in Great Britain when it came to placing the blame on the war. Many historians assert that British public opinion in 1898 and 1899 did not favour a war with South Africa, and historian John Mackenzie argues that the purpose of propaganda at this time was to preserve the empire in the hearts of citizens. So at this time, newspapers became a crucial way in which the public opinion could be turned to favour the war effort, and they were therefore equally as crucial when it comes to influencing public opinion about British and South African Jews and their place in the South African crisis and later in the war. Examples of this can be seen in newspapers like the Manchester Guardian, which kept its readers informed in all things regarding the South African crisis. It printed a piece from J.A. Hobson, which J.A. Hobson also published in his book, The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Effects, which he published in 1900. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with it. So he was reporting from South Africa, and he stated that about the population, stating that the Boer population is a mere handful of officials and their families, some 5,000 of the population. The rest is about evenly divided between white settlers, mostly from Great Britain and the Kaffirs. He continues, the town is in some respects dominantly and even aggressively British, but British with a difference. That difference is mostly due to the Jewish factor. Most of these Jews figure as British subjects, though many are in fact German and Russian Jews who have come to South Africa after a brief sojourn in England. The rich, rigorous and energetic financial and commercial families are chiefly English Jews, not a few of whom here as elsewhere have anglicised their name after true parasitic fashion. So there were those who were opposed to the war that also blamed the Jews as a sinister presence in South Africa. Also, the question of how British a Jew is another theme that runs throughout the entire war and in the early years following it, as we'll see later on when we're talking about the Aliens Act of 1905. And in addition to this, other anti-Semitic public views included politicians. John Burns, trade unionist and Labour MP, particularly associated with Battersea, delivered a speech in Battersea Park in 1900, during which he stated that the South African Jew has no bowels of compassion. Every institution and class had been scheduled by the Jew as his heritage, medium and dependent. Where he could not intimidate, he corrupted. Where he could not corrupt, he defamed. The Boers defend their land not from a nation armed, vindicating a righteous cause, but against a militant capitalism that is using our soldiers as the uniformed brokers' men, turning out the wrong tenants in South Africa for the interest of the Jews. With wisdom, foresight and kindliness, we may yet retain South Africa for the empire and humanity, even though we may lose it for the Jews. So not only is Burns insinuating that the Jews are responsible for the war, but he's also saying that the Jews allowed English soldiers to fight for their own gains, the main one being financial. So the place of Jewish soldiers in the English army was, in the decades leading up to the war, a precarious one. It's possible to see the treatment of Jewish soldiers in the English army before the war through newspaper articles that were published in the decades before. For instance, one newspaper published an article that stated, for a long, long series of years, Jews were excluded from the military service. It was not a privilege, it was a disability, and intended as such. A regiment in whose rile and rank a Jew should have served would have considered itself degraded. The soldiers would have as willingly associated with robbers and murderers as with an unbelieving Jew. While saying this, the article does somewhat defend Jewish soldiers by noting that they have served in every army and dyed their blood with every battlefield. For a further example of this can be seen in the Aldershot Military Gazette. An article was published in September 1882 detailing Jewish soldiers in the English army. And during this article, it talks about Jewish soldiers experiencing trouble in gaining leave to attend synagogue on Sabbaths and to observe the rites of their religion. It continues, stating that because they are few in numbers and marked men, they often are subjected to senseless jokes from their comrades, and they hide the fact that they are Jewish. Interestingly, the article does also give instances of place of Jewish soldiers in foreign armies, like France, Holland, Germany, and Austria, where Jewish soldiers are given the necessary leave in order to observe their religion. And it ends by saying, if a similar liberal spirit were displayed in the English army, the number of Jewish soldiers would probably be greatly augmented. Even in Russia, Jewish congregations are permitted to provide kosher food for their brethren bearing arms. So through both of these examples, it can be seen the environment that the men who volunteered to fight in the South African War were entering into. And these newspapers clearly advocate a more liberal view to liberal attitude to Jews in the army. So when the South African War ended at the end of May 1902, plans for various memorials to the soldiers who lost their lives did start to appear. It was about this idea that a memorial would highlight to the rest of England the sacrifices made by the Jews to the war effort, and as well it would show their loyalty and dedication to the British Empire. There are references to a Jewish war memorial being reported about across the country from as early as 1903, 2 years before it was eventually unveiled. For example, in the Coventry Evening Telegraph, it reported in November 1903 that the close of services held at the principal London synagogues on Saturday, informal meetings discussed a proposal to found a memorial in honour of the Jewish regular soldiers and volunteers who lost their lives to the South African War. The scheme was spearheaded by influential British Jews like Cecil Sebag Montefiore, J. Waley Cohen, S.J. Solomon, Colonel A.E. Goldschmidt, who was the founder of the Jewish Lads Brigade in 1895 and was chaired by Sir Isidore Spielman of the Jewish Historical Society of England. It was reported that the memorial tablet be erected at some synagogue centre, and there was also plans to establish a general memorial in the shape of a trophy to be presented to the National Rifle Association and competed for by teams all around the world, but it seems that the trophy never actually came to fruition. So as we saw earlier, the anti-Semitism in the public eye concerning Jews in England was pretty rife. And throughout the 19th century, especially in the last years of the century, anti-Semitism was also increasing everywhere in continental Europe. And as a consequence of this, the shores of England found themselves met with Jewish immigrants coming to escape persecution and prejudice they were encountering in their home countries. So in the early years that followed the South African War, there still seemed to be some unrest when it came to the place of immigrants, mainly Jewish, in Britain. And on the 11th of August 1905, the Aliens Act was passed, and it was made an act of law in January 1906. And the main purpose of this act was to prevent the landing of undesirable immigrants, and it gave the Secretary of State the power to make an expulsion order to expel undesirable aliens. And in the building up of this passing of this act, there was plenty of opposition to it, mainly from Jewish people with concerns that this act would only increase anti-Semitism towards them, although some Jews did support the act because they didn't want the association with more immigrants. So there were early suggestions for some kind of alien bill at the beginning of the 20th century, even before the South African War was over. And concerns about the repercussions of this act on Jews and anti-Semitism can be seen from as early as 1901. There was especially concern about the place of the East End of London, which was where the Jewish immigrants lived. And in a lengthy article about anti-Semitism, the Jewish Chronicle published details of a meeting that took place in November 1901. Concerning the East End, the speaker of the meeting, a Mr. Gelberg, said that it hung like a nightmare upon his mind. And there were suggestions that the expansion of the Jews over the East End was the main cause of the unpopularity of the aliens in East End of London and was hastening the advent of an alien immigration bill. So the act meant that ships that had no more than 20 foreign passengers could be refused refused entry, and custom officers had the power to turn back those who could not support themselves. Robert Winder asserts that whilst it was aimed above all Jewish migrants from the Baltic, the act could be invoked against any would-be immigrants. However, it would seem that the act was feebly enforced. Inspectors were installed at 14 ports, but it became obvious that it did not work very well. The fact that customs officers could only inspect and turn away immigrant ships with more than 20 foreigners on meant that migrants could get around this by travelling in smaller groups. And as a result of this, around 40% escaped inspection. Furthermore, the benefit of the doubt was given to any immigrants who alleged that they were escaping religious or political persecution. Winder further suggests that if Europe had remained at peace, then the Aliens Act most likely would have been fallen into disuse. But the First World War meant that the Aliens Act was tightened and sealed for good. So the Jewish Chronicle reported in 1904 that the War Memorial Committee would erect a tablet in memory of the Jewish soldiers who fell in the South African campaign on the external wall of Central Synagogue in Great Portland Street. The newspaper also reported that during the discussion of the proposal, it had been said with some force that it should not be the object of the community to advertise their merits in public, but to leave others to discover them. Great Portland Street was a neighbourhood that people constantly passed through. The purpose of this memorial was not only to commemorate and record those British soldiers who did not come back from South Africa, but also to highlight the fact that Jews living in Britain, and indeed in other parts of the empire, as we shall see, were dedicated to their country. It was the idea that people could stumble across these memorials and be impacted by them in this way, that made this location and the idea of the memorials in general so appealing. So the unveiling itself at Central Synagogue on the 19th of March 1905 did welcome many honorary officers. The most notable guest was Lord Roberts himself. He was also attended by other officers such as Major General William Henry Mackinnon, Colonel of the CIV. The unveiling was also attended by Chief Rabbi Dr. Herman Adler and the Reverend Michael Adler. These memorials were reported to be of bronze and surrounded by a border of white marble and was placed on the outside wall of the synagogue. Isidore Spilman spoke at the unveiling, thanking Lord Roberts for his attendance, and in doing so, said that the memorial bore eloquent testimony to the fact that British Jews were inspired by a love of king and country, no less enthusiastic and no less devoted than that animating their fellow subjects. It testified that, in vindicating their claim to the same liberties and rights they shared, an equal privilege of defending and of dying for their country which conferred them. At this time, as well as before the war, as we have seen, Jews in Britain were feeling a sense of unease at the anti-Semitic rhetoric that was aimed at them, especially when it came to people very publicly blaming them for encouraging and starting the war in the first place. Spielman's open remarks about Jewish devotion to king and country demonstrates the climate in which these memorials were being established in, and perhaps why they were needed in the first place. So following on the same theme of display of patriotism, Lord Roberts, upon attending the ceremony and unveiling the tablets, said that he was deeply sensible of the privilege conferred on him, asking him to unveil the memorial to Jewish soldiers. And perhaps even more significantly, he said that throughout the campaign, they were to him the same as soldiers of his own religion, each soldier fighting for his king and country. And he continues saying, from reading the names of the tablets, he found that nearly every branch of the service was represented, not only by regiments belonging to the regular army, but various other branches of the British Army, the British Empire in Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Indeed, a very splendid record. No doubt Lord Roberts' very open message to the Jewish community in this way was very welcome. And both of these messages from Spielman and Lord Roberts not only highlighted the patriotism of Jewish soldiers, but they also highlighted the value of empire. So of the 114 men named on the tablets, information on how most of the men lost their lives was available. 45 of them were killed in action or on patrols. There were almost 60 deaths from disease or illness, and the main disease that's killed was enteric fever, or as we know it today, typhoid. There were deaths from wounds, hemorrhages, dysentery, even consumption. One man, Joseph Jacobs, of the Cape Volunteer Medical Staff Corps, was killed when he was struck by lightning whilst attending to wounded and sick soldiers. David Goldstone of the Western Province Mounted Rifles drowned whilst bathing at Picketberg. Essie Levy was reported by the Jewish Chronicle as missing since the 9th of June 1901, so we simply don't know what happened to him. And many of the men were children of immigrants. And we have some information on about them. Most of these men are buried and memorialised in South Africa where they died. However, some were brought back and buried in England. Theodore Isaac Levin was born in Cheltenham. His father, Reverend Hyman Levin, was a Polish immigrant, and he was appointed minister of Cheltenham Synagogue in 1874. Theodore Isaac went out to South Africa in 1895 with his brother Lewis, and they both had a successful business in the Transvaal until the war broke out. He fought in the First Brabant's Horse, and he died of wounds in Hanover near Spyfontein on the 2nd of July 1901, aged 21. And upon his death, his family commented that consolation being, however, derived from the fact that he died a glorious death, which reflects honour to him both as an Englishman and as Israelite. Lewis Barnett fought in the Western Province Mounted Rifles, and he was killed on patrol in 1901. And at 16 years of age, he was reportedly the youngest Jew fighting in the war. J. Hess is one of the examples of a South African Jew who fought in the side of the British. He fought in the Imperial Yeomanry, and he was killed in action on Christmas Day in 1901. And other South African Jews on these memorial boards include I.E. Cohen of the Border Mounted Rifles and Samuel Cohen of the Cape Volunteer Medical Staff Corps. Eugene Gross was born in London. His father, Henry Gross, was a wine merchant from Rotterdam, Holland, and his mother, Isabella, was from Dublin. He fought in the Colonial Light Horse, and he's an example of one of the men whose bodies was brought back from South Africa, and he's buried at Willesden. Alfred Henry Marks was originally from Bow. He enlisted under the surname Marsh, again because of persecution of Jewish people and Jewish soldiers. He fought in the 2nd Scottish Horse, and it's reported that he rescued a wounded comrade from the line of fire, brought him back to camp on horseback, and then returned on foot to the fighting and was killed in action. He was aged 18, and his parents erected a memorial tablet to him at East London Synagogue. So Edward Levy moved to London from Swansea after the death of his father. He had 6 sisters. His father was a well-known clothier in Swansea, and before Edward left to fight in the war, he worked for Raphael Tuck and Son, who were fine art publishers. He also attended the Westminster Jews Free School, and he fought in the Prince Alfred's Volunteer Guard, and he died of typhoid in February 1900. Jack Moeller, this is one of the few pictures that we have. He's the one in the light square on the right-hand side. So he fought in the New Zealand Rough Riders, and he died of typhoid at Springfontein in July 1900. He attended Nelson College in Wellington in New Zealand. And upon hearing of his death, the college printed a statement in which they praised him as a student and also said, on his departure with the 2nd contingent for South Africa, several handsome presentations were made to him by his numerous friends. The death of one so intimately allied to us in the comparative solitude of that distant African township brings home to one with vivid insistence the reality of the colonial sacrifice in the interests of empire. So among the 2 Jewish soldiers on these boards who died fighting as volunteers for the CIV was Harry Aaron Marks. He died of typhoid in Bloemfontein on the 17th of April 1900, and he was reportedly the first Jew CIV killed in the war. His brother, Captain Nathaniel Marks, fought in World War I, and he also died of disease in July 1918, and he's buried at Willesden. So Aldershot Synagogue was opened in March 1912. The opening of the synagogue was widely reported about across the country, with detailed reports being published in numerous newspapers in various counties. Before Aldershot had its own synagogue, it was reported that Jewish soldiers had use of one room in the town for their prayers and worship, but there was a large increase in Jews who joined the army, so a bigger space was needed. The ceremony that took place for the opening of this synagogue was attended by as equally prestigious people as the unveiling of the original tablets at Central Synagogue 7 years earlier. Reverend Michael Adler led the consecration, and also present at the ceremony were Sir Matthew Nathan, who was a highly distinguished and famous British soldier and a colonial administrator, and he also was of Jewish descent. There was also Major General H.J. Duquesne, representing the local military authorities, the Reverend J. Sims, a chaplain to the forces, and among many others from the local authority and soldiers from Aldershot. And upon the opening of the Aldershot Synagogue, Sir Isidore Spillman had replicas made of the war memorials at Central Synagogue and donated them to be on display at the synagogue in Aldershot. And it's these tablets which now stand on the wall of the portico at Willesden. These tablets remained a point of reference for many Jewish soldiers for many decades until the synagogue's closure in the 1960s. And during the First World War, Private Samuel Marks, RAMC, sent to the Jewish Chronicle a piece about the synagogue and referred to it as a warrior's temple. And in this piece, he says, "The outside walls are painted red. The door is a closed-in portico. Don't enter yet, but look on either side of the doorway. 2 large tablets meet your gaze, inscribed with many names. Strange, they are of Jewish in appearance, Yes, they are the names of those who fell in the South African War, for Jews also are warriors. So the types of attitudes that we see in the public eye from newspapers concerning Jewish patriotism, or rather their supposed lack of patriotism, shift somewhat during the war. For example, we still see newspapers publishing pieces clearly highlighting the sacrifices of bravery being displayed by Jewish soldiers fighting in the battlefield. And as previously alluded to, many soldiers hid their religion upon enrolling to fight, as we saw where there were soldiers like Alfred Henry Marks who enlisted under a different surname. An example of this can be seen in an article published by the Jewish Chronicle in July 1901, and it quotes an article that was published in the Times from MP William Burdett Coutts, who went to visit soldiers at the front. He writes of an encounter he experienced with a wounded soldier. He recounts someone asking this soldier questions whilst a form was filled out. The soldier answers all the questions about his name, his regiment, his injury, but when asked his religion, the answer comes in a low monosyllable. Unwanted here. Even the corporal repeats it inquiringly, and a quick movement runs round the group. Jew? Jew, repeats the low voice, but more firmly now, and with a suggestion of why not in the accent. He is a brave man, for in the tent he never flinches when his dressings are removed. He too, like the Catholic buried this morning, has fought for the great white queen. And with this article, the Jewish Chronicle also described it as an independent and almost accidental testimony to Jewish gallantry. So even with some pushback against common Jewish stereotypes when it came to the war and whether or not Jews were seen as patriotic or not, the memorials both at Central Synagogue and, as we've seen, at Aldershot Synagogue became a reference for people to point to when there came to a question of Jewish loyalty. Even 15 years later, during the First World War, it was seen that Jewish loyalty was still being questioned. In this piece put in the Jewish Chronicle in 1917, Ernest Leopold Walford wrote into the Morning Post, and in it he states, in the South African War, service was voluntary. Outside the Central Synagogue, Jews who laid down their lives for Queen and country in the South African War, outside the Central Synagogue in Great Portland Street is a bronze plaque giving the names of about 200 English Jews who laid down their lives for Queen and country in the South African War. I personally have lost in the present war 2 nephews who volunteered at the beginning of the campaign. So the fact that the original boards were first presented at the same time as the Aliens Act demonstrates their purpose. And if one looks at the precise wording of the tablets, it suggests something more. Loyal and patriotic memory of the soldiers of Jewish race and faith who lost their lives in service to their country. It serves in response to the question of Britishness. When some of these men died fighting in the war, as we saw, their family members said how they were proud to fight as a Jew and as an Englishman. So in conclusion, whilst the original memorials at Central Synagogue were destroyed during the Blitz in 1941, their existence is still so important in highlighting the public demonstration of the sacrifices that Jewish soldiers made for their country and for the British Empire at a time when they were being doubted very publicly. They are established at a time when the place of Jews in Britain was under an immense amount of scrutiny. These replicas are, of course, of equal importance. Not only is it that without them, we would have very little records of these men who fought and died in this war, but they also serve as some of the oldest national Jewish war memorials. These have been forgotten about, all but lost to history. And whilst nowadays we may not agree with the cause in which these men gave their lives to, these memorials show how these men very much agreed with the cause. They felt it was worth their life, and these men shouldn't be forgotten. This piece of history shouldn't be forgotten, no matter how controversial it may become. I can't answer the questions about how we memorialise the past or how we remember our war dead that fought in a campaign such as this one. But I believe that this history does belong to all of us. It belongs to the Jews and to Wilson, of course, but it also belongs to Britain. The treatment of Jews in the Edwardian period was so impactful in a negative way that it caused this memorial to be unveiled in the way that it did in the first place, that we cannot simply ignore it. When Hester gives a tour of the cemetery, she comes to these boards and she likes to say, Wealdstone Jewish Cemetery, where even memorials come to die. Well, now hopefully they've been brought to life a bit more and have been left for others to discover them, as the War Memorial Committee has so strategically placed the originals at Central Synagogue all those years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Due to Hester is visible, but we're not 100% sure her signal will be, audio signal is too good. So rather than Hester, Molly, can you, sorry, just wait a second. I need to, sorry, we need to unshare your screen.
Okay.
If you just stop the screen,
Okay.
that would be great. Thank you. Yes. So because there's a bit of a tech problem here with Hester's line, I'll just deal with some of the questions that have been put in before I ask Hester to join us at the end, because we just don't have one. Now, the first one is sort of a little follow-up that, before I get into some more detailed questions being sent in, and if you do have any, can you use the Q&A, preferably to the chat? It's easier for us to see. But one question from Eva Vromovich that she just thought she might have missed. Did you say that the British Army accommodated kosher food during that time?
So the bit I was referring to was during the 1880s, when a newspaper journalist was comparing the treatment of Jews in this country to Jewish soldiers in other countries. So that instance, it was Russia. In Russia, they were permitted to provide kosher food to the soldiers when they needed it. So that was what that was in reference to, yeah.
Thank you. So, as I said, we've had some questions have been coming up during the talk and some that were sent in earlier. And I think two of them may actually relate to the same point. We have a question from Edward Teager, and which says, were there any Jewish people who fought on the side of the Boers? And a question that was sent in earlier by Anne Malkin, who said, I wonder if you could ask the speaker if she had any information about Jews who were living in the Free State and Transvaal Republic at the time of the Boer War and who got caught up in that as well. Do you have any, did you come across that during your research?
The only Jews that I know of that fought, that were living in South Africa, I'm not 100% sure about ones that fought on the side of the Boers, because obviously my research was to do with the ones who were on the British side. But the man, Joseph Jacobs, who died when he was struck by lightning, he actually, I believe he was originally from Plymouth, and he actually moved over to South Africa. I can't remember the year, in the late 1900s. And he actually moved over there with his wife. And apparently when the war started, he drove with his wife and his sister-in-law and his sister-in-law's newborn across to Cape Town. And apparently it was reported that along the way he was spat at and insulted by the Boers. So those were the only instances that I specifically have from my research, but there were definitely British Jews that did get caught up in it all.
And during your research, did you come across any commentaries or observations about why these young men actually volunteered? That was a question from Emma Tate.
So I didn't find anything specific. A lot of what comments that were made after after these men died were from their family members who said that they felt as Englishmen they had to take part in the war. That's the only instance that I have of them. I believe someone suggested that it could have been the poorer ones could have joined the war to escape poverty. That could be very likely. But the ones that I've looked at have been because they felt it was their duty as an Englishman.
Thank you. Just clarifying, we have had a message from Alex Davids, who said he's ex-South African and does know of Jews who fought on the side of the Boers, but he doesn't have any information with him at the time. So thank you, Alex, for that. So you make, yes, Les Kazin says, you make reference to those who died, approximately how many, do you have actually the number of people, Jews that actually served? Did you come, is there a figure anywhere for that? So
I believe that it's two, because so many Jews changed their surnames and kind of hid their religion upon enrollment. I don't think that it's possible to find an exact number. So, I mean, that may have changed since I've been looking at stuff, but from what some other historians have said, it's really difficult to actually find a number of how many Jews did enlist, because they hid their religion, especially, you know, like I said, as they were being blamed for the war, they were probably worried about any persecution about being Jewish and fighting this war. So I don't think that couldn't come across a number of Jewish soldiers that enlisted. So.
And did you find any details of when any of the Jewish soldiers received awards or medals?
So I think the most notable one I can think of was Jacob Whaley Cohen. So he survived the South African War. He took part in both the First World War and the Second World War. He died in 1948. And he was incredibly, he had lots and lots of medals. He had one that had 4 clasps on it. And so there were lots of Jews that still were very prestigious and got a rank and a title for themselves and were given medals. I can't think of any more to hand, but there definitely were a few.
Ivan Sugarman has sort of kind of following on from that in the sense of awards. He wrote in earlier to a question, in view of the exclusion of immigrants post 1890 who probably not been naturalized and could not serve in Asian forces, and there was no conscription, and there was the prevalence of anti-Semitism, the Jewish death count seemed quite high. Is there any particular reason? Was it particular campaign, the actual battles or so on that they fought in that led them to be the death rate to be so high?
I'm not sure.
No,
I mean, I don't know how to answer that. No.
Just whether you came, as ever with these things, it's in research whether you came across anything.
Of course, yeah. I didn't come across anything specific about that. No. And
again, in the records, Simon Goulden said, "Were there any Jewish chaplains in the South African campaign?" Reference that. Hester's nodding. We'll bring Hester on in a moment. Yeah, I'll bring Hester on in just a moment. I think. Right. Okay. Just to explain that we are saving the chat, so I will be saving the chat at the end because I think there's quite a lot of background information that's being given, which may be of assistance to the research. So I'll be forwarding on that to Molly anyway.
Anything's welcome.
Yes, I should just explain that we have a lot of we do have viewers from around the world, Israel, the America and South Africa. So I think we're capturing quite a bit of information.
Brilliant.
So what I'm going to do, hopefully, while I just checking a couple of other points, I'm going to ask Hester to come in at this stage. So if Hester can unmute yourself. And I think there's one particular question that you wanted to speak about, and that is the one from Eva Vromovich again. Are you all right to read that one, those out about the boards, or do you want me to read them out, Hester?
Oh, read them out.
Yes, so there's a particular question. So it's actually came in 2 parts, Eva, so just bear with me. No, it's not, it's a bit further down. Right. Right. So I'll just actually explain that Hester is the project leader for the House of Life Heritage Project at the United Synagogue at Willesden Jewish Cemetery. And so she's sort of leading this project. So that is why these 2 particular questions I think are relevant. Eva Vromovich asks, would you comment on the aesthetic form of the Aldershot tablets? And there was actually another one that she's added. Were there any Boer War memorials that integrated Jewish names? And can you see the problem that Jews had with cross-shaped memorials, such as those that were common in World War I? Do you have any thoughts on that, Hester?
Okay. Hello, Eva. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to introduce Molly after Malcolm spoke at the beginning because I've been having internet problems, and I may indeed go silent now. But while I'm still on, I should say, when you ask for a comment on the aesthetic, it's simply that these are different from the ones that were on the outside wall at Great Portland Street of the Central Synagogue, because as Molly explained, they had a kind of fluffy marble surround. It was, I would just describe it as like a kind of cotton candy, all sort of circular like that. And these are mahogany, with a mahogany frame and bronze lettering on a perhaps a dark wood background. Isidore Spielmann was the chairman of the design committee, which also included somebody from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And he was an art entrepreneur who represented Britain at the equivalent of, World Expo. And he took pre-Raphaelite paintings to the Paris exhibition in 1901 to represent Britain. So the aesthetic must have been very much his idea. Other than that, I can't really say. And the question of the names, Molly alluded to the fact that many of these people changed their names from presumably possibly Jewish, Yiddish, Russian sounding names, but many of them would have been middle class, in which case they would have had English sounding names anyway. And the question of crosses, actually Reverend Michael Adler plays a very big part in all of this. And you've heard that he was there, he was the rabbi, the minister then of the Central Synagogue, and he became the first Jewish military chaplain, very important during World War I. I'm sure many of the Jewish Historical Society members know a lot more about him than I do, or we do. And it was he who created the British Jury Book of Honour in 1922 after World War I, and he who persuaded the then must have been the Imperial War Graves Commission to design the headstones for fallen soldiers that have a Star of David and not a cross of sacrifice. So maybe that's more than enough about those two questions.
I actually have got Eva did put her hand up as well, and hopefully Eva, you should be able to say, do you want to say anything at this point?
Just to say that unless I'm not seeing it right, I was very struck by, as far as the aesthetic is concerned. Okay, so obviously they have to avoid crosses, so then the Magen David is of course an interesting choice, but also that there's something kind of oriental about the frames, especially the two frames from Aldershot Synagogue. That they seem to be sort of slightly kind of Persian or orientalizing, and I thought that was an interesting choice for these patriots. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much of its time. I would say that it's very much of its time, and it's probably one of the few things that softens the aspect inside the portico at Willesden. Molly has been looking for a newspaper report which apparently has a photograph of Aldershot, but the British Library's been closed. So if anybody finds one, there's a tiny photograph of the one outside the wall of the Central Synagogue in Peter Rent, and another one in the book that Molly showed you.
Yes, while I'm just going to, there's a couple of people who got their hands up, but while I ask them to unmute, one question from Alan Mann. Do we know if any Jewish women went on to serve in South Africa, especially as many soldiers seem to have died of disease, specifically typhoid? Did you come across any of that, Molly? I
didn't, but as you say, I'm sure there were. I didn't come across any in my research, but I mean, I'm sure if you looked for it, you'd probably be able to find something out there. It just wasn't in my line of sight when I was doing my research, but I'm sure there are.
Thank you. Now, Glenn, the problem is your name has disappeared off. So Glenn, are you able to, do you have a question? I can't, yes, is it Kirshner? Sorry, it's the label has blocked your name off, so I can't see your surname.
But basically, I was born and grew up in South Africa, and I understood, this is a political question, that because there was diamonds and gold discovered in the two republics, Transvaal and the Free State, that was the real reason why Britain went to war against the Boers, as opposed to this question of loyalty to the empire. That's my first question. And the second question, my grandfather was an Uitlander, a foreigner, and he fought on the Boer side and was wounded in action.
Thank you. Yes, I can see, sorry, Glenn Kirshner, sorry, it's come up on questioning there. Have you just any thoughts on what was said there, Molly?
So yeah, for sure, the main reason why there in Britain went to war was definitely because of the gold and the diamonds. Definitely, that was definitely a very important factor. I think what I was trying to get across was that there was still, in terms of why leaders of countries of the empire sent people and contingents to South Africa, was because of the empire, and because they felt strongly about upholding the empire. But obviously it was definitely more political than that, in terms of the threat to British supremacy when gold and diamonds were discovered in places like the Transvaal.
Thank you. Jackie Bush, if you can unmute yourself if you've got a question. Jackie? No. Okay, we'll go on to Dr. Gavril Sivin, if you would like to unmute yourself if you have a question. No. Who's that? No. Hello, yes, just speak up. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I've got a problem with the microphone.
Right.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Excellent. All right. About half a century ago, I was the director of the South African Zionist Federation in Johannesburg on leave from Israel. I'm originally a Liverpudlian. I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is that reference has been made to the fact that, Jews had a certain relationship with the Boers or didn't have a certain relationship. I personally, when I was there, had a very good relationship with some of the Afrikaners who were by no means as backward and prejudiced as people have been given to think at times. The other thing I wanted to say, I think it's very nice that in Britain there should be a interest taken in this particular subject, because it's the sort of thing that has not fallen by the wayside in the course of Jewish history. As a matter of fact, I happen to be the chairman of the Israel branch of the Jewish Historical Society of England, which, despite what was said from Leeds, I think still has the largest attendance of any branch of the movement, since we get anything up to 100 people at our meetings. Thank you very much, and best of luck.
Thank you, Doctor. I will leave the dispute between you and Malcolm as regards the numbers, but I can tell you today we've had over 170 attending, so this is the difference. Right. Jackie, are you there or not? No. We have Josephine Jackson. Do you have a question? If you need to unmute. Yeah.
I hope. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine, thank you.
I'm in the south, in Bournemouth, sunny Bournemouth, but I used to live in Leeds. And all good wishes to people who know me. I did know Malcolm and Maureen very well. Anyway, my question is, the Aliens Act, way back in 1905, we have history repeating itself. We've got refugees, lone children not being allowed into this country. We've got Lord Debs, who himself came on kinder transport, trying to persuade the government to allow these children in. What can we do to persuade people that refugees, so often, as history has shown, do contribute greatly to their adopted country?
Interesting question. I would just say before I invite Molly, I would say that whilst I'm in Leeds, I was born in Bournemouth, so it's a good place. So there you go.
Yes.
There we go, as everybody in Leeds knows. Right, Molly, have you just sort of any observations on that or not, or anything, or we just take it as an observation?
It's a very good observation. It's a very good question. I mean, like some of these soldiers that fought, their parents came over as immigrants. So that's the only kind of link I can make. But it's a very important observation. I don't really have a great deal that I probably could say on here about it. But no, I agree with you completely.
It's a perpetual question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, where are we? Sorry. Yeah, just to go after an observation I would make. I know you relied a lot on newspapers during your research. And of course, we now look at social media and false news and fake news, sorry. And whilst, of course, the newspapers that you were referring to had a time delay in them, because of course there was the time of getting the news back to the UK and so on. Do you have did you see any similarities, well, over 100 years on as to where we are now about the power of the media, the written word and the newspapers in your research?
I think there was a power of it, and I think that they relied on that. And I think that responses to deaths of Jewish soldiers was used in a way like when family members would be commented as saying that they their son died a proud Englishman. I think that they were used in a way that was seen to be a powerful thing, and that could help to change public opinion, or maybe not change, but try and influence it in some way. So I think that in terms of the contrast there is what we'd have in the news today. I think that, yeah, there's something there.
I'm going to just take one more question before I hand over to Hester. She's going to deal with a couple of questions as well. Ivan Sugarman, I did actually ask you a question, but I think do you have a follow-up? You need to unmute yourself.
I have a library of 100 books, first editions on the South African War, all written between 1900 and 1910. Reading in its political question, in the negotiations in 1898 and 1899 between Kruger and Alfred Milner, it appeared to me that Alfred Milner forced the Boers into war. What is your opinion of that?
So I didn't do a massive amount of background reading for all of that, because that wasn't my main focus. I just wanted to get enough to kind of provide people who don't know much about it with a context. But I did read a couple things that that maybe people were suggesting that he had a more important role in kind of pushing the war. But that's kind of all that I read on it. There's more that I could read about it, but that's the only thing that I saw.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, just before I do, there was one question which I suppose which I did spot from Nigel Grizzard, and it's an obvious one, bearing in mind we are from Leeds. Were there any soldiers from Leeds or Yorkshire listed on any of the boards, or do we know that at all or not?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think there were a couple regiments that were from Yorkshire, or that had Yorkshire in the name. So I don't see why not. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can always post it somewhere if you want me to follow that up, for sure.
Now, I'm just going to hand over to Hester. So if Hester wants to unmute and hopefully a signal, there's one question you specifically want to answer, isn't there? From Janice Crombie, is that right?
Yes, it relates to, Janice Crombie has mentioned that her ancestor was Barney Barnato, the very famous and controversial mining magnate, in her words. Did Molly come across such characters in her research? And before I pass that to Molly, I should say there's also a couple of questions from Les Kazin, who's also one of our researcher volunteers, of all people. The kind of remarkable thing about this war memorial story is that almost everybody involved in it is buried at Wilson Cemetery if they didn't die in a war or go on to live another life on another continent. So I could list the founders of the Jewish Historical Society, including Sir Isidore Spielman and Reverend Michael Adler, Barney Barnato and all his family, and his nephew Wolf Joel, Colonel Jacob Whaley, who Molly mentioned, and his grave is one of them, is that terracotta sort of Celtic looking with a Star of David on it that Molly showed when she was describing some of the life stories of some of the men who served. Now, of course, the flip side of the people who died is the people who survived and went on to fight another day, literally. And Jacob Whaley fought in World War One. And in World War II, he had, I think, a desk job, but he was still very much in the armed forces, and he survived until 1948. Much less is known, and I think just from the comments that people who are on this call are making, we are already being able to see a whole world of people who survived, and some were prisoners of war, and others who had that experience but went on and presumably were impacted by the public relations side of it as much as anything, which Molly's been talking about. Molly, did you want to talk about any other notables or anything you came across from the people who are buried at Willesden?
No, I think you covered the important ones for sure. Obviously, like Jacob Whaley Cohen and others who like Eugene Gross, who was brought back from the war and was buried in Willesden. There may have been other important ones, but I think those are the two that I can think of.
I've just been asked a question as to why are these people buried at Willesden as opposed to other Jewish cemeteries. Okay, so yes, my nose is so close up against the glass I can't really see. The reason is that Willesden was the burial place of choice for the people who were movers and shakers in the London Jewish community. And many of them were movers and shakers in other places as well. And it's a matter of class as well. It's not to say that everybody buried at Willesden was an upper class gent or the wife of an upper class gent, but many of them were. And many of the people who, as I say, were movers and shakers one way or another are buried at Willesden. Yeah.
So I think whilst, as I said, I've captured all the comments and all the questions that will go. These will go to Molly and Hester afterwards. There's some, I think if everybody's been monitoring certainly the Q&As, which people do see, there's been a lot of information that's been submitted, hasn't there? Mm-hmm. Everybody tomorrow will be getting a follow-up email. So if you do have any other information you want to send through, I'm sure Hester and Molly will be more than happy to receive it, won't you?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's it. Now, Hester, while I'm just asking Malcolm to rejoin us, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I think I would like to corroborate why we asked Molly to do this research, and really what this is part of a bigger story. Which I think may be filtering through. Willesden Cemetery has been the recipient of a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund to open the site to the public, and we've been working for actually over 4 years to make the cemetery accessible and welcoming to people from all backgrounds. And Molly is in fact one of those people. We now have 60 or more volunteers. Molly started with us as a historical researcher in 2019, just after she got her MA from Goldsmiths, University of London, in history. And we are very grateful also for the support of a grant from the Jewish Historical Society of England, the national branch, the National Society, which enabled us to develop a lot of the research and a lot of the storytelling, which you will see in the form of a new visitor centre, films, our new website, panels in the grounds, maps, and all of this sort of stuff. And we said when we made our proposal that in exchange for this grant, one of the things we would do would be to invite a young person to give a talk, to research something deeply and give a talk. So this is the end of that particular we'll continue to contribute to these stories. And we wanted to understand more about these silent boards where we no longer have a connection because it's not our community, it's 7 or 8, 6 or 7 generations ago. So I'm just going to conclude by saying my own thanks, everyone else is going to be thanked as well, and to urge everybody to go to our website, which is willesdenjewishcemetery.org.uk, to sign up there to our mailing list and our newsletter, which we send occasionally, and you will be able to find out about future talks and events we're doing, about the arrangements we're making for people to come in and visit. And you are very, very welcome and to come and see what is effectively a small transformation of the cemetery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I ask Malcolm to join in, I would just say that an email that everybody gets tomorrow, which is set as a register, those that have attended, there is the link to the newsletter included there. So people just need to click on that. Malcolm, I think.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Molly. I must tell you, one of the reasons why I was keen to have you come to Leeds was because the South African Jews, especially Cape Town and Leeds, came from the same area of Lithuania. And certainly there may be some crossover. There may have been relations on both sides. We don't know. Thank you for a very good presentation. It shows you how the study of history is constantly expanding, and we're getting more and more information all the time. Thank you very much. It's our tradition to give our speakers a book to remind them of their visit, or their talk, not visiting now, their talk to Leeds. It is written by our own Professor Derek Fraser, Leeds and its Jewish community. It's a very academic history book, and I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you again. I'll somehow get your address and send it to. Thank you again, and thank you, Alan.
Yes, Malcolm, if you just want to hold the book up because you moved it too quickly. So that's it. Bit higher up, bit higher up. There you go. That's it. There you go. That's the book.
Okay, copy will go to you. Thank you again, Molly. And thank you, Esther.
Yes, and as Malcolm has said, thank you for joining us. I know it was a little bit of technical problems earlier on, but I think, Molly, you did very well, and I can certainly see from the comments that you will see in the chat that everybody has commended you on a very good talk. So from all of us at Milim and on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society as well, I thank everybody for joining us. There will be a full list of other events that we've got coming up over the next, every week from now till, from now on it appears. We've got a wide range of talks. Details of these will be sent to you tomorrow as well. And as ever, we always say, keep well, keep safe, and good night.
Good night.
Bye.